ChemCon Asia 2026 in Singapore highlights Asia as a key region for regulatory developments and sustainability trends. At the same time, Latin America is entering a new era of chemicals regulation. I'm therefore pleased that Melissa Owen from Ambient Legal is here to help us navigate that evolving landscape. Saludos Mel! Just to start us off, what is the current state of play for so-called LATAM REACH?
Hi, Tiered. It's so great to be here. Yeah, the state of play of what we're calling Latin America REACH is really big news. I know in Asia, lots going on, but in Latin America, things have not slowed down. I think it's important to understand that when we talk about LATAM REACH, we talk about it as if it were one thing, but it's really 4 independent national laws or decrees. They've been adopted by Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil, and each of them follows a REACH-inspired scheme. They are not a full adoption of REACH. They've been localized to each country, and what they really call for is at first, a registration or notification of existing substances. The details vary. In Colombia, it's only hazardous industrial. In Chile, it's hazardous industrial and non-industrial. And in Peru and Brazil, it's hazardous or non-hazardous if they're not exempt, and they pass the threshold, which is 100 kilograms for Colombia, 1 ton in Chile and Brazil, and for Peru we don't know yet. But it's 4 different independent national schemes. Chile and Colombia already up and running. Everything was supposed to be registered in Colombia by 2025. In Chile, it's 4 phased-in deadlines, 2024, 2025, and then substances in mixtures in 2027 and 2029. Brazil REACH will be the substances need to be registered within 3 years. You'll have 3 years from the launch of the database, which we don't have yet, or the registration platform, I should say. And then Peru, we got the clarifying implementing regulation in April of this year, and we know what's going to happen there now. We have deadlines. So LATAM REACH is really 4 independent national schemes, kind of inspired with this idea that they are, inspired by or informed by EU, but also by Canada CMP and by US TSCA. So that's where we are, busy with LATAM REACH.
You mentioned that it's not really REACH. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, thanks, Tiered. I'm as guilty as the next person of calling them LATAM REACH, Brazil REACH, Colombia REACH, but they're not really REACH. They're REACH inspired, and they're different in a few important ways. First, there is no pre-registration and registration like in the EU. Next, we also are kind of data light processes. You are not filing dossiers. No technical data like, ecotoxin studies and all are filed under Chile, Colombia, Peru, or Brazil. You, in theory, should be able to notify or register a substance based on what's found in an SDS. Sometimes we find it needs a little bit more than is in the SDS, but that's the idea. Also, the registration does not allow a foreign manufacturer for now to register a substance and then absolve local importers of that obligation. So a substance might be registered as many times as it's imported into a country over the threshold. So the same substance might be registered by 600 companies in Brazil or 500 companies in Colombia if it's popular and they all import it over the threshold. It's also different because we don't have an OR except for Brazil. And so foreign manufacturers don't have that option. And finally, they're data light, and they are might even be called notification systems. Some of that changes when we move to the next steps for the registration systems, which will be prioritization leading to risk assessments. For risk assessments, some additional data, of course, will be needed, but not for the initial registration and inventories. So we're REACH inspired, but not exactly LATAM REACH.
What has been the experience so far for companies registering in Chile and Colombia? Were there any surprises as the deadlines came and went?
Yes, Chile and Colombia are done, like I said, and we definitely had some surprises. Chile was first in 2024 with its four-part, because it calls for registration of pure hazardous industrial substances in 2024, pure non-industrial hazardous substances in 2025, and then in 2027 and 2029, it's going to be hazardous substances in industrial mixtures in 2027 and in non-industrial mixtures in 2029. That'll be the bulk of registration. And in Chile, we did have the surprise that when we went to register in 2024, the platform did not work. So we were not able to register online like you were supposed to. And at the last minute, the government pivoted at the very last minute and gave us a 30-day extension. And now it's still working this way, which is registration by email. So there's a downloadable Excel form that you fill in, you update your SDS, and you email it. In Colombia, we were able, the registration platform held. All existing substances were supposed to be registered by May of 2025, and it worked. So, and all of their modalities like the REE worked. So those are some of the experiences we've got so far with LATAM REACH registrations.
Mel, returning to a point you raised earlier about the role of foreign chemical manufacturers, how can companies that supply customers in these countries but have no physical or legal presence there comply with these new laws?
Yes, it's really complicated for the foreign chemical manufacturer because there is no OR in Chile, Colombia, or Peru. There is in Brazil, but we'll get to that later. But for Chile, Colombia, and Peru, since there's no OR, you have to think outside the box. For Chile, unfortunately, not only is there no OR, but there's actually no way to protect CBI, confidential business information, as a foreign manufacturer. So we've brought this up to the government. We still don't have a solution there. And so in Chile, we just found ourselves supporting local importers. So when customers would say, you know, we need to register these substances now, I would help my international clients get them a Chile compliant SDS, not just in Spanish, but compliant with Chile GHS, and the information they need to do the registration. In Colombia, we had the great option to protect CBI of the REE, the exclusive representative abroad, or representante exclusivo del exterior, that allows a foreign manufacturer to submit some of their confidential information directly into the registration system, the INSQUI, so that the government gets that information, but the local importer does not. That's a process that has to be set up, but I help companies with it, and it worked well. Peru, luckily, has adopted the Colombian model for the REE, so we don't have an OR in Chile, Colombia, or Peru, but in Colombia and Peru, we will have this ability to protect CBI. Brazil, of course, will give us an OR, so in that country, we will have the full OR kind of based on the EU model, with the twist that for now, it does not seem to absolve importers of their dual duty to register substances. So that's kind of what, as a foreign manufacturer, you find yourself in this role of supporting your local customers during their registration, sometimes even letting them know that the registration obligation exists. So it's different and evolving in the region.
What advice are you giving companies on how to prepare for Brazil REACH?
Yeah, I do not think it is too soon to start. We know that in Brazil, the registration platform, the official launch of that platform will kickstart the 3 years that industry has to register its substances. But I don't think that by law should be by the end of 2027. So the platform should be ready by the end of 2027, and then companies would have 3 years to register. But that seems like a long way off, and you and I know, Tyr, that time flies. So I recommend companies already start getting ready for Brazil REACH by doing some mapping, some readiness assessing. I think they ought to figure out how their substances flow into Brazil. They need to figure out if they're exporting to Brazil or they manufacturing in Brazil. A lot of multinationals are doing all of the above. They have a subsidiary that might be doing some custom blending, that might be importing. They might be selling to customers in country direct from HQ. So their local subsidiary doesn't even touch those substances. So they might be both an importer and a manufacturer and supporting other customers that are importing substances that don't even come through the local subsidiary. So get a handle, map your commercial processes, map your substances, start getting those tonnage bands, search the law 15022, and the implementing reg, which is due any day, for exemptions. Is there a possibility that you are not even covered by this thing? So map those substances, map those processes. It is not too soon.
We hear a lot about Brazil, but honestly, Peru REACH is the one that has already published its implementing regulation earlier this year. What's new or different about Peru's approach?
Yeah, Peru's approach is really different, tiered. So it's got what I call a two-step, two-pathway. So the two-step is that they opted to break it apart. There will be first notification, and then there will be registration of volumes for hazardous substances in a platform. So the first step will be notification, which for them is you will submit your classification, your SDS, and your label. And then if the substances are hazardous, the following year you will be required to enter those volumes with regard to those substances in a new database known as RENASQ, or RENASQ. And that is the two steps. But there's really two pathways, because if the substance is regulated by the Ministry of Environment, that's the process. And if it's regulated by the Ministry of Health, like it goes through a sanitary registration or some other kind of approval process with the Ministry of Health, then there won't be that notification step. That will be done as part of the registration of your substance, your final product with that agency. And so in theory, the government agencies that have that information or should have that information will enter and populate the RENASQ for you, and you will enter the volumes there will be entered by the government agency, by the Ministry of Environment agencies. Ministry of Health agencies. So it's a complicated two-step, two-pathway, and then it's a 4-part registration deadlines, and it's based on their minimum classification list. So if it's a hazardous substance and appears on the classification list and you concur with the classification, it's 1 year. Following years for substances on the list with a different classification. Third deadline is for hazardous not on the list. Fourth is for non-hazardous. And those registration deadlines, we don't know the threshold till late 2027, and the deadlines start in 2028. So Peru is definitely worth rolling up the sleeves and getting in there and looking at the deadlines, that minimum classification list, and figuring out how your products, who has jurisdiction over them, because it has real implications for Peru's system.
We focus mainly on South America, but Latin America is a much broader region, stretching from Mexico to Argentina, including Central America and the Caribbean. What chemical regulatory developments should companies be watching for in those other markets?
Great question, Tier, because we talk so much about LATAM REACH, you'd think that's all that's going on. In my own Mexico, I will tell you that we know in 2019, we said that, we need a REACH-inspired scheme or some kind of a chemical framework, and that's not coming. So not in the near term, and I don't even see it in the medium term. It wasn't mentioned in the environmental 5-year plan for 2025-2030. It wasn't mentioned in the recent, like in May, they published a draft redo of our principal environmental law, not talking about chemicals at all. So the developments in Mexico to watch for are the chemical precursor rules evolving and how we handle those, regulation of certain substances. We're simplifying processes for certain registered chemicals. And then in Mexico, interestingly, it was actually a change to the custom law that's driving a lot of change in practice. New customs law requires, actually places personal responsibility on customs brokers for the information they submit to the government. So we've been seeing companies calling me with a lot of customs brokers asking a whole lot of questions they never did for our chemical products, and we're having to let them know what an SDS is and that they don't need a formulation and things like that. Very busy expansion of GHS that companies should be aware of. New countries adopting GHS like El Salvador last year, and Panama starting a working group for that, and expansion of the GHS in in countries that already had it, like Argentina just this year requiring GHS labeling and SDS for all crop protection products, even consumer lawn care care products. You have the GHS labeling required for consumer products in Chile, eventually in Colombia and other countries. So that's a really big trend I see. And then just adoption of the GHS in countries that haven't even adopted it globally are adopting it for specific substances, like Dominican Republic in 2025 for hazardous household cleaning products, hazardous personal care products, hazardous cosmetics. So GHS expansion, and then also always changes to the chemical precursor rules. Brazil is, has up for public comment, major changes to its rules on chemical precursors. I don't think the impacts will be that great, but it just shows how these existing schemes that you think you already understand, the edges are always changing. So you need to be looking at that. And a lot of regulations on regulated chemical products that change on the regular, whether it's making the process for import easier, like in Argentina or Mexico, or redefining substances. So definitely keep your eye on GHS and chemical precursors and kind of the, the old standing regulations around regulated or registered products, chemical products. That's what I'd say is going on in the rest of LATAM, Tiered.
Thanks for sharing your insights, Mel. I'm looking forward to seeing you, along with many Latin America regulators, in Montreal in March for ChemCon the Americas 2027.